Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Nation Building. On our program, we examine the political, social, and moral issues in the leadership of our country, the Bahamas, and also the region. And on our program today, we have a very exciting program. We're going to be feeding you with a lot of educational information today on a number of nation building issues. And we're going to introduce our guest to you when we come back from this break.
What is a promise? A promise fulfilled can mean so much. A bond, a commitment, a yes in a world of maybes. We made a promise to you, and we delivered. Our superfast LTE network is now on every island, and every day we invest in local communities and technology. Because our promise is our guarantee. And now we promise our best is yet to come. Alive, believe in best.
Hello and welcome back to Nation Building. I'm your host, Winston Pinnock. On our program today, we are taking a trek around the Caribbean, and we are in Jamaica, and we are speaking with an educator at heart and someone who has had a wealth of experience in a number of areas and has a lot of history as well. And of course, we are introducing to the Bahamas today Mr. Robert Gregory. He is the Assistant Teaching Fellow at the Mona School of Business, UWI, here in Jamaica, in Kingston. Mr. Gregory, welcome to Nation Building.
Pleasure.
Thank you. We are taking a trek around the region, and we're specifically looking at Caribbean states, and we're talking about issues that affect our country, common issues that affect our countries, and we're looking for solutions, and that's what you, the people, say you want. And so today we believe we have some issues that you will hear solutions discussed to how the way forward. Mr. Robert Gregory, as mentioned earlier, is not only an educator, he is the former chairman of the Firearm Licensing Authority here in Jamaica, and I could go on and on. He has led a number of government organizations, training organization, other institution that has been vital to development of the country, and some of which are instrumental. We have similar institutions in the Bahamas, of course, and in some cases we're looking to create some of these institutions. And so we believe we're providing information that our country needs to hear, and also information that you, the public, will find learning educational. Mr. Gregory, before we get into the multitude of issues that we have to discuss today, thought with the wealth of knowledge that you have, that we would just spend a little bit of time in talking about the state of education. After all, you are an educator in the region during your days of your upbringing.
Well, the state of education in the region, in my own opinion, is not up to what the region requires in this 21st century. Largely, the essential tenets of education essentially are intact from what we inherited from colonial times. And one must remember that the education system in the colonial context was for a specific purpose. First of all, the majority of the workforce is in the Caribbean, in the colonial territories in the Caribbean, including Bahamas, was there to cut cane and banana. I mean, essentially, we came across the Atlantic as enslaved Africans to do labor. So the agricultural economies, the plantation economies of the 17th and 18th and 19th century have now given way to the 21st century, the knowledge era, the knowledge economy, and the education system that was established for the colonial era, which was really to teach you conformity and obedience. Children must be seen and not heard, and rote learning 2 times 2 is 2, and so on and so on. That was to prepare you for occupation and in your place in society. And that has all changed. The society has changed, the economy has changed, but the education system remains essentially the same.
Before you go further, I just want to quickly ask, can't help it, are you suggesting that the colonies were in some ways indoctrinated by the colonizers?
Yes, right after the Emancipation Declaration in the British Parliament in 1834, right after, and remember, the emancipation, the abolition of slavery, was followed by a 6-year period of what they call apprenticeship. This is teaching the slaves who have been working at whatever they've been working at for 400 years to do as apprentices what they've been doing for 400 years. I mean, the absurdity of it all. What we really realized what has happened, was that the British government compensated the slave owners for 50% of the loss. And they were making up the remaining 50% by keeping the very emancipated slaves as apprentices, doing the same thing they were doing for 400 years to make up the other 50%. That was what that was about. And, it is painful when you think about it. At the same time, they passed something called the Negro Education Act in the Parliament. And that provided a huge sum of money at the time. 90% of it was to establish what we now know in Jamaica and probably around the Caribbean as these traditional high schools. These schools were really for the sons and daughters of the gentry. Okay, us black people gained entry later on, predominantly after
What period
independence.
was this, just to bring things in context?
Well, this came into the grant was actually disbursed in the region 1835
Or thereabouts.
to 1840, I think it was, that period of time. So you had schools like in Jamaica established, like Hampton School, Woolmer's Boys School. Time, of course, and the focus was on boys. So a number of these schools that have been around for quite a while, that we refer to in Jamaica as traditional high schools. Okay, and I'm sure you have the same kind of situation in the Bahamas. They have it in the Eastern Caribbean.
Everything.
This is one of the legacies of the colonial education system. So now, for the case of Jamaica, when we became independent in 1962, 68% of our people were illiterate. 68%.
68.
Illiterate.
Almost three quarters.
Almost 3/4. Okay? So when people talk about the good old days, and the good sound reading, writing, and arithmetic education that only a few had access to, come independence in 1962, we started off building this nation with 68% of our people couldn't read and write. Now, we have moved that to 85 to 88% literacy. Okay?
But we have gotten poorer in the process. How
Well,
comes?
Poor is relative to rich. I'd ask what you mean by poor. In certain respects, we are, in my opinion. I can name the respects. But in other respects, I mean, you hear people talk about the good old days, as I mentioned before. And I say, well, good old days for who? It wasn't good old days for my people, by and large. And we have come a long way. Predominantly in a material sense. There are issues to do with our spirituality, our sense of ourselves, our identity. Some of these issues are blurred and confused. And I would say, well, maybe we have not made progress in that regard. Probably we have become poorer. But materially, undoubtedly, the average Bahamian, the average Jamaican citizen, black citizen, is better off than he or she was.
Health-wise, standard of living.
Health-wise, when we have life expectancy that is comparable to the U.S. I mean, so in many regards, we have definitely made improvements, undoubtedly.
Tell me about your tertiary education. After all, you would have left here to go off to school overseas and obviously educated yourself to the point where successive governments, I believe, would have asked you to serve in any number of institutions. So what did you study and what qualified you to?
Well, first of all, I went to high school at Kingston Technical High School. This school was founded in 1896. It was founded as Kingston Manual Training School. This is the notion of so-called technical at the time. It was about giving you skills.
For those who weren't lawyers and doctors?
Well, lawyers and doctors were reserved for a few.
Okay.
But, we still have the notion that, the quote-unquote bright ones become lawyers, doctors, and in latter days, engineers.
Right.
But anyway, I went to Kingston Technical High School. I was fortunate because my physics teacher was Marcus Garvey's son. So I received a lot of education, not necessarily in the mainstream curriculum.
Right.
But I was
history,
and I met Amy Garvey, his mother, who lived on Mona Road, and so I was particularly oriented and conscious when I left high school. I went to the States to study industrial engineering, and eventually started and then transferred to management. I went to the City University of New York. So I did a BBA, Business Administration, first degree, and then I did graduate work. I did a master's in Human Resource Manpower Development at the New School for Social Research. And so I spent about 11 years in the US, almost 11 years. I was recruited back home into the private sector. I worked at the Institute of Management and Production. It doesn't exist anymore. It was owned by the ICD group of companies. And I was program director. And we provided management training and consultancy services to the private sector predominantly. Yeah. And I spent 5 years there, and then I was asked by the same group of companies to open up and start a offshore manufacturing concern. At the time, the US had this 807 program where you would, bring in US components
and
fabricate
manufacture
here
clothing and stuff.
And re-export to the US, right? And so I spent 5 years manufacturing pantyhose for the Sierra Leone Corporation, Legs and Hanes pantyhose. So I'm a pantyhose expert. But that was a real eye-opener because they had many of these 807, principally garment factory. But
and they were all through the Caribbean.
Throughout the Caribbean, right. And they were really exploiting cheap labor. That's really what the attraction was.
Right, and they've now since learned that India and other places can help them.
Yeah, but cheap labor is also very expensive. Anyway, it was what it was. And it lasted for a period. They're no longer here. I don't even know if the program is here. But what was interesting was that I went to South Carolina and learned how to make pantyhose and started a factory that actually ended up at 650 employees. We produced 60,000 dozen pairs of pantyhose, 40-foot trailer loads per week. But it was a very interesting experience for me because I experimented. I was operating under the premise that our people, properly equipped, could outperform their counterparts. The average age at the plant was 23 years old. I really preferred nobody with any experience. Green persons coming into what was created as an oasis of respect, and I mean respect for everyone, supervisors, managing directors, everybody. We treated each other with respect. It was the first air-conditioned factory in Jamaica. And the persons came in there. I had an attendant in each of the bathrooms, the male bathroom, the female bathroom, permanently there. I have a thing about bathrooms. And the first place I went to when I come to work in the morning was the bathrooms, to inspect them.
As CEO?
As CEO. That was my first order of business. And it sent a signal. Of respect in a very fundamental kind of a way. And then hired an army chef. He had just left the army to prepare healthy meals in this air-conditioned factory. The canteen had glass all around, so you could see out into the production area from inside the canteen. And I had breakfast ready at 5:45. The morning shift started at 6:30. So at 5:45, there was nice breakfast ready, sausage and ackee and all kind of stuff. So people made it their business to come to work.
You incentivize your staff.
Incentivize them. So when my morning shift kicked off, I had 100%, very close to 100% on board, ready to work, fed, ready to work, in a good mood. Counterpart factories were talking about a good 15%, sometimes 20% people don't come to work on time. And the afternoon now, I put on a movie in the canteen. The afternoon shift started at I think it's 2:30. So by after the morning shift had their early lunch at 11, I put on a movie, bring in the afternoon shift on time, catch a movie, and then proceed to work.
Okay, that is a very interesting and intriguing way of motivating people. You're watching Nation Building. I'm your host, Winston Pinnock, and we'll be right back after this break.
What is a promise? Our promise fulfilled can mean so much. A bond, a commitment, a yes in the world of maybes. We made a promise to you, and we delivered. Our superfast LTE network is now on every island, and every day we invest in local communities and technology. Because our promise is our guarantee. And now we promise our best is yet to come. Alive, believe in best.
It's the market for the entire family. Sawyer's Fresh Market. Bahamian owned and operated, Sawyer's is known for the lowest prices on meats, produce, fresh fruits, and vegetables. Check them out on Facebook and the Freeport News to find out all of their weekly specials and their monthly blowout sales. Sawyer's Fresh Market. Your grocery bill just got lower.
Who said you can't get great quality products at an affordable price? If you want the best quality food products at the most affordable prices, you must pick up the Jamaica Bahama brand of fine quality products at your favorite food store. Products like Jamaica Bahama Coconut Water, the most healthy and refreshing drink on the market. Jamaica Bahama Fruit Punch, the only fruit punch in the Bahamas made from real fruit. Jamaica Bahama coconut milk, green pigeon peas with coconut milk, condensed milk, kidney beans with coconut milk, corned beef, green pigeon peas, mackerel, and corn. Jamaica Bahama's fine line of products is available at all your favorite food stores and convenience stores nationwide. Telephone 351-8282 in Freeport and 341-4091 in Nassau. I don't wanna win. No, no, I don't wanna win.
Hello and welcome back to Nation Building. I'm your host, Winston Pinnock, and today we are having a very, very educational discussion and informative with Mr. Robert Gregory. Of course, Mr. Gregory is an educator at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in Kingston, Jamaica, and he is also a leader in the country who have served in a number of areas, including leading a significant entity called the Firearm Licensing Authority in Jamaica, the organization that issues small arms to citizens. We are going to talk specifically about that in a little while, but we are having an interesting discussion looking at his role, some of the roles that he played here in Jamaica, and sharing some of those examples of what can impact our country positively, things that we can learn from their experiences here. Mr. Gregory, you were talking about your professional life, I know you also served in developing a number of government entities. If you could quickly share a few of them with us briefly.
Well, in 1991, the government of Jamaica and the governments of the Caribbean, the CARICOM community, actually signed what they call a CARICOM TVET, Technical Vocational Education and Training Strategy, which was geared to put in place mechanisms, essentially the establishment of training agencies in each of the Caribbean territories that would oversee the training and the certification of the workforce to international standards. Because this was the beginning of the globalization process and the opening of the Caribbean economies to global competition. And our workforces were not globally competitive. So the idea of having regulatory training entities overseeing the training, the development of curricula, occupational standards, training, and the certification, benchmarked to international standards, training of chefs, training of mechanics, training of all occupations. And so at the time, the Jamaican government, having signed that treaty, decided that an entity, which was established back in 1982 for vocational training, it was an actual training provider institution that was funded by a training levy that employers paid, called the Heart Trust. The trust is the trust fund into which the training levy is paid.
So just before you jump ahead, because I think this is important, our country is also going through an experience where there is a national training agency. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that the approach the Jamaican government used was to have private sector put funds into a trust?
The private sector finances the workforce training and certification.
So that's mandatory.
By way of a training levy. 3% of their wage bill is paid into the Heart Trust Fund.
Interesting.
Right. This methodology, this training levy methodology, was something established years ago in South America and in a number of other places in the world. So it was something adopted by us back in 1982 to finance the training. At the time, it was training of young people, because the government at the time, under the leadership of the then Prime Minister Edward Seaga, established the Heart Trust. And it was really to address the difficulty our high school graduates with certification, the difficulty they had in transitioning from school to work, with their 15 subjects, but they couldn't do anything, okay? And so to make good the transition, they established this training.
Let me just quickly ask you this. I don't want to lose this thought, because what you're saying is so critical. Is it then that the experience, from your experience, the traditional high school graduate, doesn't it point to the fact that that system was a failure in that it was not preparing?
Well, that's what I'm pointing. It was, again, another aspect of the legacy from colonial education, okay, which probably served its purpose back then, but it's no longer relevant to the 21st century Caribbean, 21st century society, or 21st century economy. People need, education in the 21st century prepares you for life and for livelihood. Mm-hmm. If you have all the credentials and you can't even boil an egg to feed your family and yourself, of what use is the education? So education in the 21st century is really enabling and empowering you to create value. Whatever that value is, writing novels, fixing cars, whatever the value is, your education prepares you to do that. And so when you have people with credentials who are unable to find a place in the economy, it is a difficulty. And this is a difficulty that the then Prime Minister was trying to address. This is what we call the school to work transition. And so this providing of training, which in the first instance was on-the-job training. So what he did was to establish the training levy and say to employers, look, if you take a high school graduate who has indicated an interest in marketing, accounting, whatever it is, you take that person into your company. You can waive paying the levy, and you, in exchange, provide the training on the job for these high school graduates. Okay, so that was the first program of Heart. It was called the School Leavers Training Opportunities Program. But of course, the vast numbers more of youngsters either dropped out of high school or did not graduate with subjects. And they also needed to find employment. And so they established what they call Heart Academy. These were industry-specific institutions of training. The Runaway Bay Heart Hotel and Institute for the hotel hospitality sector. Another one at Ebony Park for agriculture, and so on and so forth, a farm and training institution. So every sector had its own institution that prepared persons
for that area,
for
that
entry-level positions and entry-level occupations in that sector. And so it was catering to persons who did not have their CXC or the GCE at the time. And so it provided them with some top-up education as well as occupational training. And so that was a pathway for those who didn't have the subjects to enter the workforce with occupational training and certification. So those were the two programs. And then in 1991, when this treaty was signed in the Caribbean to establish national training agencies, the government of Jamaica decided that the Heart Trust would assume the mandate of a national training agency. And that was when I was seconded from the private sector for 2 years to do the restructuring of Heart, to assume this new role of this national coordinating entity to provide occupational training and certification to all working age Jamaicans from 17 years to 70. So the focus was changed from only youth to youth and older persons of working age. So there's a facility where you can come, if your particular skill sets are obsolete, you can come and retrain and get credentials to go on. That is a facility, and this created a network of training facilities. The agency provided curriculum development, established occupational standards, made sure they're internationally benchmarked, and made them available to community colleges, to high schools, to Heart institutions, okay? So that we had this facility for the workforce to equip themselves and certify themselves to go and work here and elsewhere in the world. I spent 15 years at that place, and then I went on to become the president of JAMPRO, the Jamaica Trade and Invest, the investment and the promotion of exports. Yeah, and I spent 2.5 years there, and then after that I went to join the Mona School of Business and do consulting as well. So I've been doing that since 2009.
Interesting.
And during that time, served as chairman of the Firearms Licensing Authority, the Student Loan Bureau, and a number of other things.
Because that wasn't a job permanent; it was really oversight. Right. What? Quickly, I know you talked about this earlier, but in brief summary, if you had to point it to a sentence, what state did our colonial masters leave us in the region in after independence?
I think, to give them credit, particularly the British colonial. I mean, the French, not as good as the British. The British, one of the things the British left, not only in the Caribbean but elsewhere, governance institutions, the institutional framework, judiciary and the government administrative, civil service. That institutional framework was sound. It is what separates us, for instance, from our Latin American brothers and sisters, people who had colonial rule from Spain or from Portugal or from France. But beside that, the education legacy was one that was specific for plantation society and economy. Okay, and essentially, to be crude, if you're cutting cane and banana, you don't need to have an education. You remember in slavery, it was illegal to educate a black man. You remember that? You could suffer death for that. So and then from that experience, we had notions about education, that education really is only for bright people. And the notion that most of our black children are not academically inclined. You've heard that language before?
Absolutely.
Huh? To suggest that, you're best with your hands, and others are bright and very. Huh?
Depending on the pigmentation of your...
Exactly. There's the correlation between the two things. So these are notions that have come from slavery that we still hold on to. And so we have this exclusionary system of education. After independence, I mentioned to you, we were 68% illiterate. Access to secondary education was something that was prized. At one stage, we had what they call a government scholarship. Each parish would award a bright, poor youngster a place in one of these traditional secondary schools. You had 50,000 people at one stage, 50,000 11-year-olds taking the common entrance. And we only had 14,000 spaces for them.
And so that meant many of those who qualified still wouldn't get in.
Yeah, well, we placed we creamed off the top 14 and placed them and told the others that they failed common entrance. When in fact we just didn't have any provision for them. And people went away with this chip on their shoulder. That's the end of your education.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, you talk about the educational system and the failures that brought. Talk about the system of government, and by that I take it you mean the structure, parliament from the permanent secretary down, the system that works to cause government to work, notwithstanding who's in power. So my specific question is the Westminster system of government still relevant in our region?
I think the Westminster model is most relevant for Westminster. We have adopted it and negatively adapted it, okay? In other words, you compromise the system. The system has certain tenets, you know. One of which is precedent. Another one is honor, okay? We have the problem with, for example, Trump. Mm-hmm. Trump doing things that I now realize were not really written down as law, you know. You just don't do certain things. For example, the revelation of your tax returns. I thought it was something that was required of all presidential candidates, only to find out that it wasn't written down in law anywhere. So this man said, hell with that, I'm not doing it. It's the same thing. A lot of the central tenets of the Westminster model we choose in the Caribbean to put aside. In certain respects, something happens in Westminster, something happens in a ministry, the secretary for whatever has to resign. He or she takes responsibility for it. In the Caribbean, that is oftentimes just overlooked. Just as an example. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the Westminster model per se, but if we are adopting it, taking it as it is, and making adaptations to suit our circumstance, but positive adaptations, okay, and maintain the main tenets of it, I have no problem with it. But it hasn't been that way.
Okay, quick question. What are the pros and cons of the Republican system that the Americans practice? They're not the only ones that do it, but those are I think that theirs is most refined. So what's the pros and cons of that system?
You know, what I like about the Republican system is that sovereignty resides in the country. The notion, I've always been uncomfortable with the notion of Her Majesty the Queen being the head of state and the representative being the Governor General. I have always been uncomfortable with that, as I have been uncomfortable with the Privy Council as my final court. I think any self-respecting country over 50 years old ought not to have that. Those are the trappings of the past. With a Republican situation, even though we have Caribbean republics that still adhere to the Privy Council. So that is not necessarily a part of the Republican.
Not a true republic.
But the notion of a republic is that you have full domain and sovereignty. How we exercise the politics in the Caribbean, both in the Trinidad and the Guyanese Republic, and in the rest of the Caribbean, with the Westminster model and the Queen as head of state. The politics that we perpetuate is one that suggests citizenship and the electorate as a spectator, and the politicians as on the stage. And I find that to be disturbing, because in the Caribbean, we change governments by voting out. We don't deliberately vote in. The electorate sits and waits to hear what they're going to say. And we critique and whatever. But in a democracy, we the people have the power. We the people dictate. In
That's
America,
the way it should be.
That's the way it should be. In the Republic of the United States, that is not the way it is. How it is that, for example, you have a group of folks get together, call themselves the Tea Party. And they get together and they're voting, and they say, look, Mr. Pinnock, we're sending you to the Congress to represent this point of view. Crazy as it might be to me, that is how you listen. When politicians hear a critical mass of opinion, they jump on board and champion it. So there's a kind of an iterative between the politician, the representative, let's call it representative, and the people who they represent. In the Caribbean, you don't have that kind of
The people,
relationship.
the people wait for their
to
politicians.
say, and so we don't vote in
You vote-
to go and do what we say.
You vote out.
You vote out in disgust,
You-
and the other one comes in to replace them.
You're watching Nation Building. I'm your host, Winston Pinnock. As you could see, we could hardly get to a break. We're going to take a quick break and come right back.
What is a promise? Our promise fulfilled can mean so much. A bond, a commitment, a yes in a world of maybes. We made a promise to you, and we delivered. Our superfast LTE network is now on every island, and every day we invest in local communities and technology. Because our promise is our guarantee. And now we promise our best is yet to come. Alive, believe in best.
Hello, I'm Wendell Jones, and every time I sit down and I watch JCN television, I drink the Jamaica Bahama fruit juice. It's so pleasing to the palate.
I've been cooking Bahamian dishes for generations. I now use Jamaica Bahamas product. The rice is very fluffy, very tasty, and good eating. Jamaica Bahama product is simply the best.
As an insurance agent, my life is go, go, go. But whenever I need a refreshing break, it's Jamaica Bahamas Island Mixed Fruit Drink. Good.
Hi, I'm Debbie Bartlett from GEMS 105.9 FM. The effect that Island Junkanoo Juice Medley has on me is exhilarating.
Who said you can't get great quality products at an affordable price? If you want the best quality food products at the most affordable prices, you must pick up the Jamaica Bahama brand of fine quality products at your favorite food store. Products like Jamaica Bahama Coconut Water, the most healthy and refreshing drink on the market. Jamaica Bahama Fruit Punch, the only fruit punch in the Bahamas made from real fruit. Jamaica Bahama coconut milk, green pigeon peas with coconut milk, condensed milk, kidney beans with coconut milk, corned beef, green pigeon peas, mackerel, and corn. Jamaica Bahama's fine line of products is available at all your favorite food stores and convenience stores nationwide. Telephone 351-8282 in Freeport and 341-4091 in Nassau. I don't wanna win. No, I don't wanna win.
Welcome back to Nation Building. I'm your host, Winston Pinnock, and we are here today talking to Mr. Robert Gregory, an educator at the University of the West Indies Mona campus here in Kingston, among so many other things. And with the limited time we have and so much to cover, we're going to just go straight to the questions. Mr. Gregory, you elaborated passionately about the state of politics in our region and how our people vote out governments and do not take time out to evaluate and vote in government. And the people say they feel powerless. In fact, many say on election day every 5 years is the only time when the political leaders allow them to participate in the democracy by choosing. What say you to the people?
You see, again, another legacy of the colonial times. Allow me? How do you allow me? How dare you even use the language allow? I'm a citizen in a democracy. I have the power.
But after all, political leaders in the Caribbean, in this Westminster democracy, dictate when election days are called.
Well, election days are only one aspect.
But to people say they allow, meaning that they don't get to, they can't remove someone from office until the Prime Minister determines he wants to call an election.
You can make things very uncomfortable or very comfortable for someone. You have to access, you see, being a citizen of democracy is not just about voting every 4 or 5 years. You have to engage actively. You talked about the Republic. One of the things I admire about the US, is the strength of the local democracy in Miss City, for the mayor, in the state.
Primaries.
The engagement of people.
Primary election system.
People calling their congressman, calling their representative. Look, I don't like the street is flooding. Whatever it is, the issue, they get on the case of the representative and get it done. We sit passively and waiting for permission to do. It's our notion of this kind of a relationship with the powers. We accord the same kind of deference to our representatives as we did to the colonial masters.
But isn't it true? But isn't it true that in a small society where political leaders determine, certainly in the Bahamas it is the case, I don't know what it is here in Jamaica, where members of parliament and leaders in government, ministers, determine who gets a job in a government position or who gets promoted in some instances, who may be stretching it too far, but certainly they influence people getting jobs in the government sector. Mm-hmm. So people feel somewhat dependent, and if people speak out, I know of many people, if they speak out, or those who in the past have spoken out about any number of issues and would have cried victimization, been let go at some point along the way because of their taking a stand. Yeah. So if what you're saying is true, how does that square with the fact that people would see examples of those who have been victimized because of them taking the stand you're asking them to?
If you spoke out against slavery, you were sometimes put to death. Did that deter the revolution that eventually led to our emancipation? You know, this Freddy notion, you have to have courage. What happens in the Caribbean is because we, the citizenry, the electorate, allows it to happen. And when we have enough and we decide to stand up, it changes. We have to decide. We complain about leadership, but leadership and followership are two sides of the same coin. If there's a failure in leadership, there's a failure in followership. And we, the electorate, sit by and blame, but we are equally culpable.
But while you talk about that, most of our countries are lorded over by two political parties. Some say mafias,
because we allow them to.
Who you can't determine. The citizenry don't determine who leads these political organizations. And therefore, I mean, system. I'm making the case. Whether I agree with that or not is not the point. That there's so much power that rests in those who lead, and there's so much manipulation or control that you can understand why citizens would feel the way they feel.
But I understand how they feel the way they feel, but they also need to understand and appreciate that it's because they allow it to be. We don't involve ourselves in politics. In most Caribbean countries, politics is viewed as a nasty, dirty, corrupt thing. The people who are our governors are our brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts, and they don't come from Mars. They don't even come from England anymore. And the way we treat them is as if they're some kind of other species that are imposing themselves on us and who we are afraid of and we don't want to speak up. We can't continue this way. We have to recognize that this is a failure on our part as an electorate, as a responsible electorate in a democracy. We have to exercise our power. And I don't mean burning down the place. When we say enough, when we, through conversation in our communities, in our churches, in our PTAs, develop a critical mass, when you ask the average Caribbean person, what vision you have for your country? Very few have even thought about it. They complain about this leader and that leader and who corrupt and who thieving and who doing that. But I'm saying, where you want your country go? There's a kind of alienation from the country, from the mainstream society, in part because of education and so on. But most Caribbean people, boy, I have to leave here because this place don't belong to me. It belongs to the big man and the politicians. Okay? If I have to make a life, I have to go to America and go seek my fortune there. That is the notion. And it is so sad. It is so sad because it is within our power to change it.
Okay, talking about
easy,
right, but talking about change and the mental state of our people, what role and what in your mind as an educator and a significant nation builder in your country, what role is the church in our region? What role do you really see them playing in bringing about the kinds of change that you've been talking about? How significant is the church?
I think the church is very significant in the Caribbean because we are very sort of, well, we are spiritual people, okay? I'm not speaking about various religions and your denominations.
Right.
But we're spiritual
Generally.
people, generally speaking, okay? I mean, in terms of the acceptance of a higher being.
Right.
And a certain moral order that we ought to be living in. I think the churches can do far more in deliberately empowering our people. The churches played that role before emancipation, you know. It was the churches behind a lot of the slave revolts, the Baptist church in particular, in Jamaica for sure, and in other parts of the region. And
in our country, in the Bahamas, the church is still a very, very powerful force.
Absolutely.
We had a government that was, some say, removed from office primarily because it took a stand in allowing gambling to be legalized against the wishes and will of the church.
Right. Well, you know, I would like the church to be the conduit for the wishes of the people. You know, the church has a role very similar to the ideal education role, to empower and to enable people. You have the power of Jesus Christ. Whatever I'm a Christian. Huh? The power of God resides in each of us. Okay? We are not supplicants and little mealy-mouly, fraidy people. We have the Spirit of the Lord in us. We are required to take charge. We're required to exert our power, our talent. We can't be subservient to some notion about why. It's just, and the church is not, as it did before slavery, to empower us to take on the guns and the bayonets. Why can't we be empowered to take on these notions of being under the repression of the politician?
Well said. Talking about guns and bayonets, the Caribbean region is suffering from crimes, violent crimes, particularly from guns. And guns are not made in the Caribbean region. A quick response to this is America responsible, seeing that they're the manufacturer, the major manufacturer of guns in this Western world? And is it something specifically that you would say that is needed to be done by the U.S. government to aid our cause here in this whole notion of gun crimes?
The U.S. is not responsible for us. By whatever means guns come in, legal or illegal, is by our decision. I mean, why do we continue thinking of ourselves as some hapless set of people? The gun crimes in Costa Rica is far less than the gun crimes right next door in Honduras and El Salvador. That's not by some accident. Costa Ricans just organize themselves in a certain way. I mean, I don't think that we need to, again, take charge, okay? We cannot continue with this disengagement of our people, the alien nation, and we're poor America, this, and pleading for America. Take charge of yourself.
Okay. We have to talk about what we really need to talk about here today, and that is the organization you served as chairman of, which is the FLA. Quickly, why was the FLA created? What is the purpose of the organization?
We had the Firearms Act that was established in colonial times. It put first of all, there's no right to bear arms in Jamaica, okay? This is not America.
Right. Same in the Bahamas.
Right. So it is a privilege that is granted by the minister. In our case, the Ministry of National Security.
And unfortunately, in our case, we don't get the privilege of carrying handguns unless it's approved by cabinet and so on and so forth.
Well, the minister and the cabinet, but it was administered from colonial times up until 2013, I think, 2007. Right. The Firearms Act was modified to bring birth to the Firearms Licensing Authority. So up until 2007, this privilege was administered by the police. So you had to go to the police station and make your application, and it made its way through, but the police administered it, and it had a lot of problems in that regard. Corruption. And also the perpetuation of the notion that it's only big man have gun, landowners.
By that, okay.
You know what I'm saying? The regular person couldn't get access. And so the Firearms Licensing Authority was established. also reporting to the Minister of National Security, but to give some kind of transparency and cleansing to the whole process of applying for firearms, but still at the discretion of the minister. So each minister in each administration would have their own particular bent. When I served as chairman, my minister then made it very clear. He wanted the 2.5 to 3 year wait for a response to your application for firearm to be reduced to 6 months.
Was
tops.
that accomplished?
Absolutely.
How long it took to get to
It took us 1.5 years of business process re-engineering and staff changes to make that possible.
Interesting. Who led that organization?
The CEO was a gentleman who we were so fortunate to get from the Bank of Nova Scotia called Dr. Kenroy Wedderburn, a master at business process re-engineering. And it made such a difference because, you know, one of the reasons that fed the corruption was when you have to wait 3 years to get a response, and a man said, well, if you give me a thing, I can see.
So money was at work to influence the timeline.
You're actually feeding that.
Right.
So when you re-engineer and you tell the public that within 6 months you will hear from us, it made such a difference. It brought a whole, a cleansing, if you like, of the organization.
Quickly, in our country in the Bahamas, the notion of having a liberalized gun policy, where businessmen, you talk about the elites being allowed to have guns. In our country, shotguns are what people get the right to, the privilege to carry.
Yeah, that's for hunting here.
Not handguns. And so the notion of having a liberalized policy on guns, like it is here in Jamaica and in the US to another extent, is frightening to our politicians. What can you say to our people about the experience here in Jamaica since you had this FLA and the liberalization of guns? Have there been a lot of criminal acts by licensed firearm holders, or a lot of shootings by people?
Criminal acts using firearms by licensed firearm holders are very, very rare. Very rare. You have people, licensed firearm holders, misusing their firearm, okay, and their licenses are immediately revoked and the firearm taken away from them. So we haven't got a problem with licensed firearm holders committing crimes. What we have a problem is unlicensed guns in criminal hands. I think this is a conversation that the nation needs to have. Respectfully, in the Bahamas, it should be discussed. There are pros and cons, of course. In the case of Jamaica, as I mentioned, it's a privilege. There are certain guidelines. You have to prove the need for it. You're a business person, you handle cash, your life is under threat, you work in a dangerous country. There are some criteria that are used to determine whether in truth and in fact you have a need to be armed. It's not just a willy-nilly give your license if you apply. Okay? But it is transparently applied. So you make your case, we have investigators that go out and investigate your background, whether you're a wife beater, your investigator speaks to members of your community, your employer, and so on. So we ensure that you are a fit and proper person to be considered for granting a license. And again, it's a privilege.
So it has worked, in short.
It has worked.
And
we have about 40,000 licensed firearm holders in a population of 2.7 million people. So, look at the ratio. It's not a whole lot of people that are armed. There are a whole lot of criminals that are armed, okay? And they fire out number the 40,000.
And my last question to you would be, is there any statistics or any notion that proves that people actually having these 40,000+ licensed firearm holders have acted as deterrents to criminal activities?
Yes. Under Dr. Wedderburn, we instituted mandatory competency training and assessment. So you had to prove your competence. You had to go through a whole series of training in the use of firearms and be assessed before you actually granted your license, and periodic retesting. So, and what that has resulted in is that your licensed firearm holder is not somebody who hasn't fired his gun for 5 years, okay? He or she is competent. And I say she, but quite a number of women who are licensed firearm holders, and they have served. I just heard on the news today, a licensed firearm holder thwarted a robbery. 3 gunmen. One was shot dead, and the other one injured, and the other one fled. I mean, and you have incidents of that. Licensed firearm holders who are intervening in situations that save the day, save lives. So it's
actually working.
Actually working.
It's been a pleasure talking to you today. We obviously need more time, and we're going to consider inviting you to the Bahamas to participate in one of our forums.
Wonderful.
On behalf of all of us here at Nation Building, we want to thank you today for tuning into this broadcast, and it's been a great pleasure bringing it to you. And stay tuned for your next edition right here on Nation Building. Have a great week.